At present, Russia's difficulties are not just confined to land and air, as it continues its costly and untenable invasion of Ukraine. It's also facing significant challenges at sea. Indeed, recent reports from NATO officials indicate that the Russian Navy is in a state of serious crisis, highlighted by its embarrassing withdrawal from the Mediterranean. Unsurprisingly, NATO officials have been monitoring Russian military activities closely, particularly following recent drone incursions into the airspace of NATO countries such as Poland and Romania. It's crucial for member nations to stay ahead of Russia, especially when many global leaders fear further aggression from the Kremlin, or even a direct assault on a NATO member, such as one of the Baltic states. Consequently, the alliance is intent on keeping a watch on the Kremlin, tracking its various assets not just in Ukraine, but in other regions as well. For some time, they have been monitoring Russian naval assets in the Mediterranean Sea, and a NATO representative recently disclosed a startling fact. Russia has almost no ships remaining in this specific area of water. The official, who chose to stay anonymous when speaking to the press, said, "It is our assessment that the Russian Navy, already limited in resources for asset placement, is facing challenges in generating forces and dilemmas that are currently impacting its position in the Mediterranean Sea." Put simply, Russia is facing such severe issues recently, with numerous assets either damaged, lost, or engaged elsewhere, that it cannot afford to sustain a significant force in Europe's largest sea. This represents a major change. Historically, Russia has always aimed for a powerful naval presence in the Mediterranean, formerly called the Permanent Task Force of the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean Sea. Even during the era of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Navy prioritized having a fleet in the Mediterranean, which was officially designated as the 5th Operational Squadron. This demonstrates the region's importance to the country's leadership, both historically and today, and the reasons are clear. The Mediterranean is not just Europe's biggest sea, it's also one of the world's most vital bodies of water. For centuries, it has been a primary hub for trade and travel, acting as a strategic connection between 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. More than 20 nations border the Mediterranean, encompassing European countries like France, Italy, and Greece, Asian countries like Turkey and Syria, and African nations such as Egypt and Algeria. It makes sense that Russia would desire a presence in that area of the globe to project its power and influence. The Mediterranean was a significant arena during the Cold War, where the Soviet 5th Operational Squadron acted as a counterbalance to the U.S. Navy's 6th Fleet, which dominated large sections of the sea. Since then, times have changed. The Soviet Union no longer exists, and the Cold War is over. Yet Russia has persisted in operating vessels in the region, establishing its permanent Mediterranean Sea Task Force in 2013. This enables the Kremlin to apply a degree of pressure on NATO's southern flank, preventing the US and Europe from having nearly complete control of the area. It also provides Russia with the chance to monitor movements and trade routes, with the option to intervene and disrupt them if necessary. Furthermore, it gives them the capacity to support any regional allies. For instance, in 2015, Russia deployed ships in the Mediterranean as part of its involvement in the Syrian civil war, where the Kremlin provided military aid to the then Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. Initially, Russia's Mediterranean Task Force consisted of a combination of vessels from both the Black Sea and Northern fleets, and it was based in Syria. Historically, it has included as many as 15 warships, supported by auxiliary vessels, with the ability to draw additional ships from the Baltic Fleet as needed for operations in the region. In the past, Moscow also deployed several submarines in the Mediterranean to bolster its stance and improve its operational capacity there. However, that formerly powerful naval force seems to have vanished, as Russia now only operates a handful of ships in the area at any one time. The NATO official who disclosed this information pointed to 2 primary factors for the decline of Russia's Mediterranean naval presence. The first, and possibly most crucial reason, is the loss of Russia's strategic port in Tartus, Syria. This traces back to the previously mentioned Syrian civil war, where Russia's attempt to maintain Bashar al-Assad's rule and defeat opposition forces ultimately failed. For many years, the Kremlin wielded significant power in Syria, But the collapse of the Assad regime in late 2024 eradicated its influence almost overnight. In fact, just days after the regime's fall, a report from Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR, disclosed that Russia had started a large-scale evacuation of troops and military gear from its two bases in the country, Latakia, its primary airbase in Syria, and Tartus, its naval facility. For decades, Russia had depended on Tartus as its principal location for refueling, docking, and maintenance in the Mediterranean. It first established a presence there in the early 1970s, following a lease agreement between the Soviet Union and Syria. The base's critical importance was evident during the Syrian war, as it served as a key point for transferring weapons from Russia to the Assad regime. A fresh 49-year lease agreement was signed by Moscow and Damascus in 2015, leading to significant Russian investment in infrastructure. This built up its presence in Tartus, with more personnel and equipment being stationed there. Tartus also earned the moniker Russia's window into Africa, serving as a springboard for the Kremlin to spread its influence throughout the African continent. For instance, it was utilized for deploying Wagner Group mercenaries to several African countries, playing a pivotal part in Russia's goal to broaden its geopolitical influence in nations such as Cameroon, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Russian control of Tartus was mutually beneficial for both al-Assad and Russian President Vladimir Putin. However, with al-Assad no longer in power, and reportedly now residing in luxury in Moscow, Russia was confronted with a stark new reality. This January, the new government in Syria essentially nullified the lease agreement between the two countries, formally expelling the Russians from the area. In the subsequent days and weeks, Russia had to evacuate its fleet into the Mediterranean, dispatching extra support ships like the cargo vessel, Sparta II, and the landing ship, Alexander Shabalin, to aid in the withdrawal. Russian frigates, such as the Admiral Gorshkov and Admiral Golovko, which had been based in Tartus for years, departed the port for a final time. Despite the Kremlin's attempts to negotiate a prolonged presence, it lost its sole Mediterranean naval base for refueling, maintenance, and resupply of its regional task force. The significance of this loss is immense. Tartus provided Russia with a dependable base in the Mediterranean Sea. This greatly simplified the task of maintaining a large fleet in the area, as the ships always had a port for docking. That option is now gone. If Russia intends to keep operating vessels in the Mediterranean, it must now deploy them from its other naval bases and ports, none of which are located inside the Mediterranean region itself. The nearest alternatives for Russia are its Black Sea ports, including one in Novorossiysk and others in the occupied Crimean Peninsula. Even so, moving ships from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean is not a simple task for Russia. It involves covering long distances, consuming vast quantities of fuel, and passing through straits controlled by Turkey. This would be challenging under normal circumstances, but it's a greater problem now as Russia is grappling with a severe and escalating fuel shortage, largely caused by recent Ukrainian drone strikes on its oil refineries, pipelines, and other fuel infrastructure. The nation has just enough fuel to sustain its war efforts, making it difficult to find surplus supplies for the long voyages of its naval vessels to the Mediterranean. Another option for the Kremlin would be to use its other ports in the north or the Baltic, such as the port of Baltiysk in the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Yet vessels departing from there would face even lengthier and more complex journeys to get to the Mediterranean. In essence, the loss of Tartus has made the continued existence of Russia's Mediterranean Sea Task Force nearly impossible. In the words of the NATO official, with that port gone now, for instance, if they want to bring a Kilo-class submarine into the area, it has to come all the way from one of their northern or Baltic ports. Sustaining operations is certainly more difficult. Evidence of this emerged just a few weeks ago in late September, when the Russian submarine, codenamed Novorossiysk, had to surface near the Strait of Gibraltar. This 250-foot, 74-meter Kilo-class sub was on a combat mission when it encountered a technical malfunction. Fuel started to leak into the bilge, and according to social media reports, the submarine lacked the required spare parts and specialized personnel on board to resolve the problem. Consequently, it had to surface and was later seen undertaking the long journey back to the Baltic Sea for repairs. This presents an entirely new set of challenges for the Russian Navy. Although it's still feasible to send vessels to the Mediterranean, the lack of an official base makes each mission significantly more hazardous. If a problem arises, assistance is very far away. The second major factor for the reduction in Russia's Mediterranean fleet seems to be a shift in focus towards the Baltic Sea, where NATO itself has been amassing a considerable force. In January, following damage to undersea cables in the Baltic, possibly caused by Russia, the alliance initiated the Baltic Sentry mission. This mission aims to bolster the security of vital underwater infrastructure and enhance the Allies' capacity to counter any destabilizing actions. When announcing the initiative, NATO's General Secretary Mark Rutte stated, "By collaborating with all allies, we will take all necessary measures to safeguard not just our critical infrastructure, but everything we value." In reaction, the Kremlin seems to have moved many of its naval assets to this region. However, the unfortunate reality for Russia is that these efforts fall short. An open-source report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies published earlier this year indicated its Baltic fleet has a total of about 69 vessels. That figure is small when compared to the full naval power that NATO members can bring to bear. To make matters worse, a large portion of these vessels are reportedly older and smaller. This was confirmed by Frederik van Lokeren, a former officer in the Belgian Navy. Writing for Naval News, Van Lokeren examined the Russian Navy's recent losses, stating, "The Russian Navy, and more specific its Black Sea Fleet, has been on the receiving end of a targeted Ukrainian naval campaign. As a result, several vessels were damaged and destroyed, and the fleet itself was forced to abandon its bases in the Crimea." He concluded, "Within the Baltic Sea, the Russian Baltic Fleet is severely outnumbered. It is not expected. The Baltic Fleet would be able to put up much resistance given the overwhelming directly available NATO forces." Van Lokeren suggests Russia might invest in marine drones, but notes NATO has an advantage here, thanks to Ukraine. NATO is continuously gaining experience in drone warfare, learning from encounters with Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, and developing new strategies. The anonymous NATO official concurs, saying, "I do think allies have a technological advantage over Russia, but we can't let off the gas and they must maintain a sense of urgency. To put it differently, as long as NATO persists with its efforts, continues to draw important lessons from the war in Ukraine, and stays committed to initiatives like Baltic Sentry, the Russian Navy has very limited options." The Kremlin's naval forces are now in a deeply embarrassing situation, evicted from Tartus with no alternative port. Their fleet is also shrinking, due to Ukraine's successful drone and missile attacks. As Ukraine continues to grow stronger, it's impossible to predict how much more damage the Russian Navy might sustain. To sum up, the Russian Navy finds itself in a dire predicament, with no signs of improvement on the horizon. You can learn more about Russia's naval struggles in our recent video on how Denmark has severed a key Baltic Sea supply line for the Kremlin. For a wider perspective on the current state of the war, watch our video that provides a detailed analysis of Ukraine's evolving strategy and why it now has its greatest opportunity to achieve a decisive victory. Remember to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications to stay updated on all developments from the front lines in Ukraine and other major global conflicts.